Wild Capital in the 21st Century, Part 3. Welcome back to the Wild Globalization Project. We're still talking about capital and capitalism. Let's talk about private property, demand and desire, and wild asymmetries. The human value game gets wildly real as we carry it around in our pockets, in our titles and accounts, or in our Bitcoined smartphones. We call it private property. It's ours. The modern human value, creativity, destructivity ethos encourages us through work or smarts and ingenuity, maybe some luck, to acquire stuff, a car, a house, a business, a piece of land, a fortune. We title the high value stuff in formal legal systems. The private property in your pocket or in your home or in your investment portfolio is the singular, hardwired example of the white and black magic power and incessant momentum of hyperhuman value. In consuming and owning private property, we all live and own and propagate capital and capitalism. That is, our human, creative, destructive powers. So in our modern lives, we take property for granted, along with the right to own it. How is that? How did private property come about? Again, as Thomas Sowell reminds us, human value creation, exchange, and distribution, or economy, starts with how we manage given resources. As we imagine the Anthropocene's footprints, we need to reconsider how peoples have experienced their value relationships with the Earth's resources. Before the Ag Revolution's 8,000 to 12,000 year run to the present, hunter-gatherer cultures likely competed and maintained boundaries for the best hunting grounds. But they didn't work the day thinking they, quote, owned or held legal title to those grounds. Rather, as their traditions and cultures reveal, they lived the Earth's spaces as sacred, as given by divine spirits. However, under the gradual emergence of agriculture, growing and controlling food resources meant managing and governing land spaces and food resources, especially grain, but also husbanded cattle and sheep. Land and space and the Earth's creatures were gradually transformed from fully open, free, even divinely given, to increasingly acquired, owned, and controlled spaces. When you chase and kill the wild goat or sheep or hunt the great bison on the open plain, they're indeed wild and free, and your life is at risk. But when you instead catch and pin up the creature, and you make it a permanent object in your corral or pantry, it's no longer free. It's now under your control, indeed your ownership. It becomes a reserve to be owned, managed, measured, even traded. Over hundreds of generations, the creature's wildness is subtly demystified. It becomes an object of value. Husbanding practices transvalued the objects and creatures it controlled. Likewise, the Earth's rich landed spaces gradually became production spaces to be managed, divided, apportioned, their wild and free openness also demystified. Agriculture gradually, over thousands of years, transvalued the human production game's relationship to the earth. A new wild emerged. This transformation created vast new economic value, but it changed human nature and the nature of nature itself. It diminished the free and mysterious givenness of creatures and spaces. By Marx's 19th century Das Kapital, land capital or the apple would be transformed to commodities, their original value transvalued to human use value, that is simply a raw, objectified physical resource that human labor taps for its use. For example, the nomadic peoples of North America's Great Plains, like the Lakota, live their lives in synchrony and synergy with the land's vast and fecund ecologies. They lived in harmony with the great American bison, Thathunka in Lakota, meaning, quote, self-sacrifice, giving until there is nothing left, unquote. The bison, quote, gave the plains people sustenance, food, clothing, and shelter, but also spiritual life. In their creation myths, the bison were partnering souls given by the Great Spirit. Kills of the hunt were sacred events and ritually celebrated rather than objects on a balance sheet. That divine connection would collide violently and tragically with the onrush of modernity's new agriculture and industrial ethos value systems. Though their cultures were highly advanced and adaptive to the plains ecologies, the Lakota were unable to compete with the more dynamic and scaled cultural, technological creativity, destructivity ethos of the peoples from the East. By 1690 of the Common Era, Europe's John Locke had declared private property a natural human right, which tended to override Plato's Republic communal property rights 2,000 years earlier. Just 100 years later, the Americans' 1803 Louisiana Purchase consummated their, quote, claim to the Great Plains and would simply overwhelm the indigenous people's primal, free-roaming communal ethos. Eurasian peoples had already moved through the advanced stages of agriculture's 10,000-year run, and subsequently through the scientific and industrial revolutions. When these new Eurasian European Americans appeared on the plains, their, quote, modern civilization had already been radically transformed and indeed transvalued from its pre-agricultural roots. This modern Eurasian ethos valued technical innovation, consumer markets, private property, financial management, complex social governance, and advanced militaries. This force of this emerging ethos culminated in the Americans' doctrine of manifest destiny. On the American frontier, private property, sanctified into frontier law and the 1862 Homestead Act, gave permanent property rights to any settler willing to work the land for 5 years. The new wild had shown up on the Great Plains. By the end of the 19th century, the great bison had disappeared, 60 million of them, and the American frontier would be laced with railroads delivering ranchers and farmers every manner of Sears Roebuck manufactured private property consumer products. Private property empowers and scales radical innovation, which then simply and logically gives rise to social economic dominance. Private property resource management simply works the quantum entanglement of wild forces more dynamically and powerfully, if less compassionately and ethically. When many information, imagination, knowledge players use their brains and place their own private property assets at risk in a winner wins field, radical and powerful innovation emerges. The massive U.S. automobile market would emerge from this same late 19th century ethos in the play of over 1,900 privately owned companies. The human value creative destructive response, transmitted in private property exchange systems, works because it also captures consumers' more or less unrestrained human desire and demand in free markets. So free-thinking, paradigm-breaking, and value-seeking entrepreneurs, the Fords, the Jobs, the Musks, the Bezos, they get their ideas and gadgets and strategies to markets of private property consumers who have money, value in their pockets to spend. These consumers want stuff, more stuff, so they buy and consume and thus create even more scaled, globalizing value. As we noticed above, this hyper-powerful production-consumption phenomenon usually emerges disruptively and asymmetrically. One nation or company or innovator can get ahead, way ahead. The new prosperity creates wealth, but it overruns the current game. Suddenly, we're standing with the Lakota, who are disappearing in the wagon's dust clouds rising on the eastern horizon. We're holding the Congo miners' hand-dug cobalt in our smartphoned hands. Or we're haunted by the ghosts of the great bison. So this wildly globalized asymmetry is one of the most salient and dominant and often tragic signatures of our Anthropocene's long run and time. Human emergence often happens, it turns out, on the heels of radical divergences. For example, this 10,000-year-long split between the pre-agricultural Americans and the Eurasians, or the recent 1800 to 1990s Great Divergence between Asian agricultural economies and the hyper-powerful European tech industry we explored earlier. And curiously, as we'll see in a moment, nature has its own value divergent plays. So what are ecology capital responses? Wildly, the ecological stage for the Americas Eurasia divergence had been set millions of years prior, deep in geologic time. Recently developed plate tectonics discoveries from the 1960s to present inform us of the tremendous impact which the separation of the supercontinent Pangaea into Eurasia and the Americas about 200 million years ago would eventually have on the asymmetrical emergence of human cultures. The divergence gave Eurasia significant natural comparative advantages over the Americas during the breakout of evolution and eventually industry in our present Holocene period, roughly 11,700 years to present. Eurasia's broad and connected geological spaces, its fertile river valleys, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, the Huanghe, its lack of severe mountain ranges, and its east-west versus north-south climatological orientation, all of these favored the more prolific creation and communication of ideas and innovations, which in turn led to the scaled growth of Eurasian population. This great Eurasian-American natural divergence was also set in play when the earliest Americans boldly ventured into the new continent before the dawn of agriculture, 13,000 before the Common Era with the Bering Land Bridge theory, or even 30,000 before the Common Era with the Pacific Coastal Migration theory. These earliest American explorers and settlers had simply cut themselves off from the more dynamic and advanced diffusion of Eurasia's agricultural and technological revolutions. So by the time their Eurasian cousins arrived in the Americas, even though the Americans had achieved significant advancements and begun their own agricultures, natural geological and demographic divergences thousands or even millions of years prior had played critical roles in the uneven advance of the human value creative responses. Scale. Roughly 10 million of us are thought to have entered the Anthropocene's agricultural period 10,000 years ago. In just 400 generations, a relatively short evolutionary period, human populations have grown exponentially. They've scaled to our 21st century's 8 billion. Our pre-ag and wildly globalized brains and souls are still trying to catch up. Recall how Robert William Fogel's techno-physio-cultural evolution reveals this exponential scale by tracking population growth against technological development. Scale is both a driver and a result of the human value creative destructive response. When more of us get together, cooperate, learn from, innovate, make lots of stuff, trade it on ever larger global markets, then hypernaturally more of us prosper, we all have kids, and poof, there's 8 billion of us demanding this stuff of life and more stuff, and our kids, more stuff. Consequently, scale also changes the quality of life. For example, as we innovate medical research, new discoveries and technologies emerge. People live longer, and poof, under modern industrial technological medicine, Global human life expectancy has scaled from 32 years in 1900 to 73 years in 2023. Likewise, while early British industry was powered by thousands of scaled, splashing water wheels, when Newcomen and Watts ignited their coal-fired steam engines, poof again, overnight we've got Marx's monopoly capital, 12-hour workdays, and thousands of kids diving into coal mines. We've got modern industrialized scale. Scale is evidence of how the human value creative destructive response has changed the very nature of human nature and also the nature of nature. Yes, the Green Revolution saved India in the 1970s, but now it may be facilitating the radical transformation of our human global community. 1 million souls a week are migrating to Asian and African cities, and at the same time threatening the fauna and invertebrate microorganisms that engender survival of all life on Earth. As E.O. Wilson warns us, quote, "The truth is that we need invertebrates, but they don't need us. If human beings were to disappear tomorrow, the world would go on with little change. Gaia, the totality of life on Earth, would set about healing itself and return to the rich environmental states of 100,000 years ago. But if invertebrates were to disappear, it is unlikely that the human species could last more than a few months," unquote. Aha, so notice how once we survive catastrophes, like global famine in the 1950 to 1970s, or the world wars, the new survival paradigms trigger scaling change. Scaled industrial agriculture changes food production but gravely imperils the planet. Manhattan ends the war, but nuclear weapons proliferate. By the 1989 Cold War wind down, in just 4 decades, the global nuclear weapon count would peak at over 60,000, and our 21st century still owns 12,000 nuclear weapons. We call it MAD, for mutually assured destruction, when of course it's really scaled and wild madness. Physicist Geoffrey brilliantly describes scale as emanating from what we're calling this universal human circumstance, which humans have taken to hypernatural dimensions. Quote, "The study of scale is a way of thinking, about asking big questions and suggesting big answers. It's about how some of the major challenges we're grappling with today, ranging from rapid urbanization, growth, and global sustainability, to understanding cancer, metabolism, and the origins of aging and death, can all be addressed in an integrated, unifying conceptual framework. It is about the remarkably similar ways in which cities, companies, tumors, and our bodies work, and how each of them represents a variation on a general theme manifesting surprisingly systematic regularities and similarities in their organization, structure, and dynamics. A common property shared by all of them is that they are highly complex and composed of enormous numbers of individual constituents, whether molecules, cells, or people, connected, interacting, and evolving via network structures over multiple spatial and temporal scales. Some of these networks are obvious and very physical, like our circulatory system or the roads in a city, but some are more conceptual or virtual, like social networks, ecosystems, and the internet," unquote. The human value creative destructive response plays under this bigger game's rules. But with our hypernatural creative destructive powers, we've scaled even nature. Our wild game and rules emerge from the scaling quantum entanglement of protean, chameleonic forces, ecology, demographics, culture, technology, economy, governance, and wealth. And why would we expect capital or capitalism to behave any differently? There's a footnote to scale called Accelerating Finite Time Creative Destructive Singularities. West, however, points out a big catch to the human value creative destructive response when he says and asks, quote, "Why does the pace of life continually increase, and why does the rate of innovation have to continue to accelerate in order to sustain socioeconomic life?" Unquote. His team is tracking what happens when unrestrained growth of wealth and resource consumption pressures zero-sum finite resources, when, for example, our 8 billion, quote, need or demand, well, everything. Cars, food, smartphones, energy. In just 10,000 years, we've gone from survival need to, quote, market demand prosperity. Homo sapiens' amazing emergence has also set in motion severe risks and challenges for our 21st century and our kids' futures. Quote, "Resources and energy are the necessary fuel for growth, but the superlinear scaling of wealth creation and innovation leads to unbounded, often faster than exponential growth, consistent with open-ended economies. This is satisfyingly consistent, but there's a big catch, which goes under the forbidding technical name of a finite time singularity. In a nutshell, the problem is that the theory also predicts that unbounded growth cannot be sustained without either infinite resources or inducing major paradigm shifts that reset the clock before potential collapse occurs. We have sustained open-ended growth and avoided collapse by invoking continuous cycles of paradigm-shifting innovations, such as those associated on the big scale of human history, with the discoveries of iron, steam, coal, computation, and most recently, digital information technology." And he goes on, "Unfortunately, however, there is another serious catch. Theory dictates that such discoveries must occur at an increasingly accelerating pace. The time between successive innovations must systematically and inextricably get shorter and shorter. For instance, the time between the computer age and the information digital age was perhaps 20 years, in contrast to the thousands of years between the stone, bronze, and iron ages. If we therefore insist on continuous open-ended growth, not only does the pace of life inevitably quicken, but we must innovate at a faster and faster rate. This is clearly not sustainable, potentially leading to the collapse of the entire urbanized socioeconomic fabric. Innovation and wealth creation that fuels social systems, if left unchecked, potentially sow the seeds of their inevitable collapse. Can this be avoided, or are we locked into a fascinating experiment in natural selection that is doomed to fail?" Unquote. So what to do? We're back at the what's next question. Let's summarize. Capital and capitalism, American football, and the pay it forward turn. Capital, capitalism, money are sexy and powerful subjects for our what's going on question. Money might be the ultimate aphrodisiac. It's money, after all, and all the cool and powerful stuff you can do and buy with it. So they're sexy, but do the names, the labels, distract us from what's really going on in the game? Humans love to play games. Basketball, football, baseball, soccer, poker, chess. Our games are usually named after the, quote, object in play. The ball, the cards, the chessboard. But labels don't capture the what's going on of the game. They can't capture the thousands of hours of practice, training, conditioning, actually the wild learning it takes to play the game. So we're thinking of capital and money using game theory. And we're wondering if the name misses the drama and the wild energy of the play. Football might be the quintessential modern game. Football is primal. It's tribal warfare fought with committee meetings called huddles, and it's punctuated by violence. Football generals, the coaches, direct their troops, the players. It's a ground attack called the running game, combined with an air attack, the passing game. And it's all directed by a quarterback with a, quote, cannon for a passing arm. It's hyperhumans performing magnificent running, leaping, catching, tackling, and blocking athletic feats. It's elegant technologies, instant replay, artificial intelligence feedback, informing coaches and players' decisions. It's formal blackboard plays, public governance, that then blow up with the quarterback's line of scrimmage last-minute audible, followed by the hike of the ball and the player's spontaneous, instinctive, split-second, streetwise reactions, which we'd call private governance. It's black and white bureaucrat officials regulating the game's market play with rules and measuring sticks. And football is all about the pigskin, an ancient symbol of the ritual hunt. It's about moving the ball down the field. Football is also a theater of human desire and power. Fanatic fans put on war paint. They gather communally around the sacred gridiron and perform bonding and power rituals. The players emerge in fiery explosions to the pounding music of military marching bands and fighter jet flyovers. But unlike the Roman Colosseum's life and death, thumbs up or down killing, modern football rewards the victors and the losers with sexy diamond rings, massive capital wealth, and fame. So the fans aren't just watching and players aren't just playing. They're all reenacting an ancient warfare ritual. Remarkably, however, for the modern fan, football games actually sublimate. They transform and transvalue our violent and deeply rooted Homo sapien natures into capital value meritocracies. The fans spend hundreds, even thousands for the Super Bowl to buy tickets and food and beer and swag. The players become millionaires, multimillionaires, and the teams are worth billions. Football creates value, winners, and it destroys value, the defeated. We end up with extraordinary, wild, and many would say irrational human value. We know that for a fact because other humans are willing to pay billions in, quote, capital to own a pro football franchise. But the value they're buying is the consumer's wild demand, the mystique, the wild desire to experience a universal human drama. And that, many would say, is very sexy. Football is virtualized warfare fought with knowledge and violence for the prizes of power and fame and money. So what is football worth? George Halas paid $100 to buy the Chicago Bears in 1920. Today, the team is worth $6 to $8 billion. America's team, the Dallas Cowboys, is valued from $12 to $15 billion. And the National Football League, or the NFL, is valued at $228 billion. What has the NFL wildly learned? What does it, quote, know to create that wild value? It knows that Americans and now people all over the globe enjoy ritualized communal power displays, hyperhuman athleticism. They enjoy beer and dogs and violent play. Like the football label, money and capital are sexy labels, but they don't capture the human creative destructive value response. That is, the more or less unrestrained desire to know, to yield power, and to thrive. Capitalism and money abstract and so hide the raw, wild learning and knowledge and imagination that creates human value plays. This is the magic that lurked in Marx's mysterious value forms and that would eventually stifle and ultimately outwit his economic theory. To understand the wild power, the risk, as well as the potential of capital and capitalism, we have to see and live it as the full play of synergistic, hypervariable, and black box forces. Ecology. Capital and money are human value systems that live and play in natural ecologies. Human intelligence, once ecologically threatened with near extinction, has tapped into billions-year-old energy and natural value orders to turn the tables, to reverse the risk equation and now threaten the extinction of the planet's natural orders. Or demographics and culture. Humans lived out their universal survival dramas to expand populations and creative destructive value exponentially into the 21st century's 8 billion. However, massed globalized urbanization is reversing hyperpopulation growth while dangerously over-concentrating human hyperactivities. For example, energy demand, pollution, habitat destruction in mega cities. And like no other creature in the natural world, and for tens of thousands of years, humans have created immeasurable value by celebrating their existence in the mysterious universe through the practice of sacred faiths and art forms. Or take technology. Tech initially emerged as power tools of environmental adaptation and survival. Humans now invent and deploy tech to create new hypernatural capabilities like space travel, pharma, or artificial intelligence, which may simultaneously disrupt and destroy previous techs and tech cultures and trigger gaping socio-political asymmetries. Consequently, tech advances ahead of our abilities to manage its practical and cultural impacts. Or look at economy. Human capital economy has always emerged from the advance, competition for, and the exchange of knowledge resources to manage and exploit natural resources. Knowledge to survive ice ages and volcanic winters. Knowledge to hunt wild animals. Knowledge to grow foodstuff and husband animal resources. Knowledge to invent new tools and innovate new strategies and exploit given resources. Knowledge to advance science and fundamentally wonder and explore the physical and metaphysical mysteries of the universe. On the wave of thousands of years of wild learning, often violent competition and crisis survival, modern humans now deploy complex, globally connected valuation and exchange systems to manage economic values. However, the transformative power of the creative, destructive human value response routinely disrupts and then transvalues our definitions, our measures of, and our existential understanding of value itself. As knowledge economies advance, not only do its commodity deployments change, for example, from wind and water to steam and fossil fuel power, stone tablets to paper to digitization, but the very measures of value morph imperceptibly over decades or millennia. Small village hundreds of familiar faces to urbanize thousands or millions of anonymous faces. It took 10,000 years. Hunter-gatherer to agriculture. It took 4,000 years. Debt-based to coinage-based economy. It took 3,000 years. Agriculture to industry, 250 years. Economy, like tech, advances ahead of our ability to fully manage legacy or pay-it-forward strategies for our kids. Or what about governance? Humans deploy complex cultural governance systems to attempt to organize and regulate their more or less unrestrained creative, destructive powers and activities. Increasingly, powerful demographic, tech, and cultural economic human value development constantly pressures government strategies. The governance of this wild value minimally necessitates formal, institutional public governance. However, governance optimally thrives with the presence of higher, spontaneous value private governance, such as informed and competent citizen response, producer and consumer market-based decisions, corporate governance, and philanthropy. Like other factors, public and private governance lag behind the increasing velocity of change generated by these quantumly entangled and hypervariable synergies, which then periodically trigger finite time singularity crises. And what about wealth? The globalized creative destructive human value response, or capitalism, will birth the first trillionaires in our 21st century. Individuals and companies are now more powerful than many nations. Sudden, globally scaled wealth can give rise to income and wealth and therefore cultural and geopolitical asymmetries. Because of its more streetwise creativity, private wealth might more quickly advance a pay-it-forward ethical imperative for our kids. And finally, wild learning. Wild learning may be defined as the formal as well as informal, extemporaneous advance of human information gathering, knowledge accumulation, and imagination, from which emerges the creative, destructive, human value responses of invention and strategy innovation. This human value response has created its latest creative, destructive apex tool, artificial intelligence. Human wild learning created AI as a co-intelligence of itself. However, by itself, AI cannot embody the imperative for ethical decision-making because it doesn't have skin-in-the-game risk, and it doesn't have kids. Nonetheless, AI is already demanding the rethinking of learning and knowledge value in our knowledge economy and culture. AI is a quintessential example of the human creative, destructive value response. It will, like the factors above, create amazing new potentialities, but very quickly disrupt and destroy status quos. Wild learning has always been and will continue to be the most essential and valuable, quote, pay-it-forward human resource that must be procreated to our kids. In summary, perhaps our most significant takeaway here is the Geoffrey West team's observation that 21st century humans should routinely anticipate that the human creative destructive value response will continue to trigger finite time singularity crises, and furthermore that the velocity of these crises will also increase. It may be that the more effective way to read and redefine history is as the series of these crises punctuated by the human creative destructive response to crises. We can also take away capital and capitalism and reimagine them as the quantum entanglement of the human creative destructive value response. But alas, capital and capitalism will likely remain sexier and therefore more marketable labels. This Wild Capital YouTube is one of a suite of Wild Globalization YouTubes. Visit our substack.wildglobalization.com for transcripts or our website at wildglobalization.com, and watch for our book out in 2026. Thank you.